That uncertainty is a major drag on job creation because the price of uncertainty for business is paralysis. Decision makers abhor a lack of clarity. You can price tax increases and labor costs into your business plan and still invest and grow. But if you don't know what's on the other side of the ledge, you don't jump off it. You sit and you wait, and that's what companies are doing. Companies are expressing a vote of no confidence in Washington because of the lack of certainty they face, and we see the effects in the lack of job growth and investment throughout our country. When business leaders talk about uncertainty, they are often talking about how healthcare reform or financial regulatory reform will end up being implemented, and those questions are real impediments to growth. But as importantly, and the subject for today, is the broader uncertainty that exists about the country's long-term fiscal stability. There is a widespread recognition in the business community that we have to make big changes now, or risk having big changes thrust upon us in the form of further credit downgrades, high inflation, or unacceptably severe austerity that would harm the most vulnerable Americans. So what does the business community hope to see out of Washington? Nearly every CEO I talk with says the same thing. If the federal government passed a real deficit reduction plan, and we'll talk about what real means in a moment, business leaders would respond just as they did in the 1990s when President Clinton and Congress adopted a long-term deficit reduction plan that gave businesses more certainty about the market. That sense of greater certainty, that confidence in the future of the country and the stability of markets, was then and is now worth its weight in gold. But as long as the federal government continues running huge deficits and engaging in kabuki dances every few months about how to fix them, business leaders will be less likely to make major long-term investments that would produce the jobs that we desperately need. One of the reasons I think that this message is not penetrating the Beltway is that too many elected officials have not spent enough time in the private sector to know that investment decisions are about more than dollars and cents. They are about expectations of where the market is moving and in which way the government will push it. And that's why today I believe the best economic stimulus is fiscally responsible long-term deficit reduction that sends a clear signal to the private sector about Washington's commitment to economic stability. Real deficit reduction means more jobs today and more jobs tomorrow. But real deficit reduction requires something else, real political courage. And that, unfortunately, is the biggest deficit we face. As we all know, the Supercommittee on Deficit Reduction has until November 23rd to come up with recommendations for achieving $1.2 trillion in savings over the next 10 years. Let me put that in perspective for you. That would shrink our deficit by about 13%. That's it, a drop in the bucket. And the federal debt will continue to grow. Agreeing to a $1.2 trillion savings would be just scratching the surface of the problem. And yet, at this moment, amazingly, it appears that the committee is in danger of failing to reach even that low bar as a result of the usual partisan brinksmanship. You know, the term gridlock was invented in New York, but when you come to Washington, you realize that it's been turned into a way of life. And I think last summer we saw the depths of Washington's dysfunction when the gridlock over how to cut the nation's spiraling deficit sunk our perfect credit rating, sent the financial markets tumbling downward, and made the credit rating agencies the target of a witch hunt. In the span of 2 months, Washington probably did more to hurt our economy, not to mention our reputation as a reliable steward of democracy and free markets, than it had done to help our economy over the previous 2 years. Whatever faith Americans had in Washington's ability to function was almost totally destroyed. At the time, it felt like rock bottom for our political system. But now, as a great New Yorker once said, it's starting to feel like deja vu all over again, only this time it's even worse. Today, the international business community is beginning to whisper comparisons about the U.S. Congress and the Greek Parliament. And if the Supercommittee falls victim to the same kind of partisan paralysis that increasingly defines Washington, those whispers will grow louder. Beyond the damage that a deadlock committee would do to our reputation, the automatic cuts it would trigger to discretionary and defense spending would come at a terrible price. We will pay the price in public safety because the cuts would, in the words of Defense Secretary Panetta, truly devastate our national security. We will pay the price in our public safety net because the cuts would fall hardest on those who most need government assistance. We will pay the price in public debt because the deficit will continue to overburden taxpayers and obligate our children to pay the debts that we are incurring today. And most of all, we will pay an economic price in lost jobs and lost growth. We cannot afford to pay those costs. We cannot allow both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue and both sides of the aisle to abdicate their leadership responsibilities. We cannot allow Washington to default on its obligations to the American people. We cannot allow the U.S. government to be put on autopilot, cutting spending without regard to the effectiveness or importance of the programs being cut. That is no ways to run a government. And as a country, we are better than that. We are stronger than that. And it's time we start remembering that, or else this Congress and this administration will be remembered for commencing the decline of the greatest economic power ever built. Simply put, we need to stop the growth in the deficit that will destroy us. We need to start creating the conditions that will allow the private sector to create jobs and strengthen the economy. And we need one thing that ties these two pieces together: leadership. Leadership in the Congress and leadership in the White House. In the past few weeks, I've talked to various members of the Senate and House leadership and members of the Supercommittee, and I know both sides want to find common ground. But good intentions are not enough. Likewise, the president deserves credit for pushing towards a big deal last summer and for offering his own plan in September. But that's not enough either. The executive branch must do more than submit a plan to a committee and then step aside and hope the committee members take action. That is not how any CEO would run a business, and at least in modern times, it's not how landmark pieces of legislation have gotten through Congress. Tough problems require determined, forceful, and bold leadership and real action. And the only ways we're going to end the era of something for nothing, and it's up to us to demand it from both Congress and the White House. Now, important as it is for Washington to take action, I will say if Congress reaches an agreement for $1.2 trillion in savings, which will probably, as we all know, be built on some accounting obfuscation and subterfuge, it would be almost as bad as getting no deal at all. Why? Because it will allow Congress to walk away from real deficit reduction until at least 2013, which would be disastrous for the American economy. And let's remember, $1.2 trillion in savings that they're talking about would be completely wiped out and then some if interest rates go up just 1 percentage point more than the budget projections assume. Interest rates today are now at an all-time low, the long bond about 3%. But it wasn't very long ago that interest rates were at 5 and 6%, and I can even remember trading bonds at 14%. And incidentally, if interest rates don't return to historical norms, even though we will have trillions of dollars in more interest expense, God help us, because that will likely mean the Fed has had to keep rates low to stimulate a stagnant economy. Thus, the only thing worse for deficit reduction than interest rates going up perhaps would be for interest rates not to go up. So we can't just say that government inaction doesn't matter and we will just grow our ways out of the deficits. Growth can help reduce them. But when we grow, interest rates will rise and so will our payments on our debt, which will add to our deficits. In fact, doing nothing and waiting for growth is not, as the slogan goes, kicking the can down the road. I think it's kicking ourselves in the head, because while we're standing still, other countries will be racing ahead of us by creating new industries and new jobs, and the longer we wait, the further behind we'll be. And then job creation and deficit reduction will be that much harder, since our competitive position will be that much worse. The reality is, if we don't take serious action now, our growing deficit problem could turn into a full-blown fiscal emergency. What we need from the supercommittee isn't a plan that tinkers around the edges. We need a bold, long-term, and comprehensive plan that will stabilize a federal budget that is hemorrhaging money and put us on the path to long-term economic growth and stability. We need a plan that looks at the economic consequences for our country, not the political consequences for the next election. And that means having the courage to admit what everyone knows. We are not going to be able to cut our ways out of the problem, and we're not going to be able to just tax our ways out of the problem. We must do both, and I'd like to suggest today two very basic principles that can get us there. First, all sides have to be willing to give on something. We don't have to slaughter the sacred cows, but we do need to get a little milk from them. Just like a base closing commission, the committee must accept that real solutions require rising above narrow partisan, regional, and ideological concerns. We need both parties to stand up to their own special interest and start putting their love of country before their fear of the next campaign. Democrats have to face the reality that we need more spending cuts, including reasonable entitlement reform, and they have to stop pitting Americans against each other in a game of class warfare for their own political purposes. Republicans have to face the reality that we need more revenue than we can get from cuts alone. And they have to stop protecting every tax break and loophole as though they were sacrosanct, when in fact many of them are just bad economic policy. There is a broad middle in America, in all 50 states, that wants each side to work together on this type of a pragmatic compromise. You know, voters are smarter than most elected officials give them credit for. From my experience, they respect courage and reward results, even if they don't always agree with you. So let's talk for a few seconds about how each party can do what the voters want by coming to the middle. Let me start with the Democrats. The good news is there's actually more common ground on the spending cuts than most people realize. Both parties have proposed at least $400 billion in cuts to Medicare. Both parties have proposed at least $200 billion in non-defense discretionary spending. Both parties have proposed some cuts to Medicaid, and both parties have agreed to peg payments more accurately to inflation by reducing the consumer price index for a savings of about $40 billion. We should do all that and more. It won't be easy and it won't be pain-free, but we cannot get our deficit under control without controlling spending. Over the past few months, I've talked with some of the leaders who have championed a bold structural solution to our deficit problem. People like Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles and the Gang of Six. They've studied this issue inside and out and done the serious research on the economic and security implications of the cuts, not just the political fallout. They've also outlined a plan for how the cuts should be phased in over the span of 10 years to ensure that they don't interfere with the current recovery.